Matter at school. My name is Sam Carwin, she, her, hers. I'm going to start with our principal, and then I'll let the others go around and say their name and their pronouns as they feel comfortable. So specifically, Black Lives Matter disability principle is: we are committed to acknowledging and addressing how we further society's othering of people with disabilities. We co-create spaces in which ableism is confronted and embed the 10 principles of disability justice advocates into our work. We actively dream and collaborate to create. And we'll talk a little bit more about those 10 principles for everyone to get on the same page, but we want to just start with names and pronouns. Jesse, you're up at the top for me, so I'll start with you.
Thanks, everybody. Good to be with you. My name is Jesse Hagopian. I'm an educator in Seattle, and my pronouns are he, him. I'm on occupied Duwamish land.
And then I have Clay and Edward.
Hi, my name is Clay. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a entrepreneur as far as consulting.
And I am Edward Hurt, pronouns he, him, and I'm a pastor of the Center Cross Church in Monroeville, Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh.
Well, thank you all for being here. And I want to start with just acknowledging the reality that when I say disability, we all have a picture in our head. And that picture might not look like the people on the screen. Oftentimes, that picture looks like what we've seen in the media, what we've been told. And it's not a full spectrum idea of what disability looks like. I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that often disability isn't apparent, and it might not be the word that someone uses to describe their everyday life. They might not say, I have a disability. They might just say, this is who I am in the way that I navigate life. I think it's important to also name that being able to get an official diagnosis in and of itself is not accessible to everybody. So sometimes people have a diagnosis, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have one diagnosis, but not maybe a full acknowledgement of what they're dealing with in their day-to-day life. Diagnosis is expensive. I'll speak for myself. When I got diagnosed with my sleep disorder, it cost $3,000 for that diagnosis. That is not something that's easily accessible. I was lucky to have insurance that covered 90% of that. That is rare. For me, I was in my late 20s, and everyone looks different in their diagnosis. So I'd like people to speak to, if you actually have an official diagnosis, what age you got that at, and acknowledge the reality that those two things might not align. What does the impact look like for you in your day-to-day life? And what's that difference of like apparent versus a less apparent disability? And I'm going to start with Clay.
Yes. So I have lupus. That is the broad disability that I have that has spiraled into other disabilities. But I was diagnosed with lupus when I was about 23 after doing a very long car ride without stopping. It started with just some cramping in my legs, and I went to the hospital, kind of told them about my family history, and then they actually tested me for it, and I found out that I had lupus. But for a lot of years, it kind of went untreated. I would just kind of go to the hospital, to the emergency room, to treat like flares. And then they would just give me like a prednisone taper. And then that was the end of that. It wasn't until I to Nebraska is when my disability actually really progressed. And when that happened, that's when I actually started having symptoms of not even being able to walk. And that's when the reality of the fact that I have a disability that can possibly kill me one day really set in for me. And so being diagnosed with lupus at such a young age, and me being a trans man, I actually got to see how the difference between me being able to advocate for myself and really doing research for myself on my disability has actually helped me in the healthcare system.
Thank you so much for that. And the acknowledgement that we can go to all the providers, but oftentimes we still have to do that work of learning more on our own time from people in community of what they're experiencing and what can be helpful for us. I'm going to go next to Jesse and then Edward.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm new to talking about my disability, and so I appreciate this space. And um, I'm learning how to talk about it and deal with it. And so it's great to be in community with you all and learn more about that from you. But I got COVID 2.5 years ago, and from that day until now, I've been dizzy every single day for the last 2.5 years. The first year was really hard. I had extreme light sensitivity and sound sensitivity. So, um, noises from multiple directions would really make me sick. I'd get nauseous. And still, if there's too much sound going on from multiple directions for too long, but I was really sensitive at the beginning. Um, I have fatigue that is debilitating. One of the hardest parts is that if I exert myself, um, I get what's called post-exertional malaise, which is like the next day, it'll feel like I have the worst hangover, like I've been drinking all night. I'm just nauseous in bed. Um, so yeah, it's been such a challenge to um, you know, reimagine my life. It's reshaped my life in ways I never expected, right? I can't drive very far anymore. Um, after it used to be I couldn't drive at all. It would feel like I was driving drunk, just like at all. But now I've worked up to be able to drive like 20 minutes without getting too nauseous, but it means that I can't attend my kids' events like I used to or take them to practice all the time. So it's just really reshaped what I can do, and I have to, I'm a musician and a writer, and one of the things I love to do the most is play harmonica in a blues band. And whew, man, it's like I still have to do that because it heals my soul. But when I do it, the next day I pay for it. And people don't know that, right? They don't see that. They see me out there performing and are like, "Oh, there's nothing wrong. You're fine. Oh, it's good to see you're all better." But then what they don't know is how hard it was to do that performance and then how much I'm going to pay for it the next day. And it's just scary, like with very little research on long COVID, very little known what's causing it, and very few ideas about how to treat it. And so I'll just end by saying the process of coming to understand I have a disability was very difficult because I thought I was just sick and it was going to go away. And, after the first few weeks, my doctor said, "Oh, most people will get better after a month." So I waited a month. "Oh, they'll get better after 3 months." I waited 3 months. "Oh, they'll get better after 6 months." And then, after 6 to 8 months, I had to readjust how I thought about myself. I could no longer just think like, okay, it's going to go away any day now. I had to try to come to terms with what this means for my life and to understand it more through a disability lens.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for sharing your experience. I know we hear about long COVID and it looks so different for everybody. So just being able to put an idea for this person, this is what it looks like, and the reality of providers not having information like they might on something that people have been experiencing more long term.
Yeah, thanks.
So I am 46. I will be 47 at the end of this month. And for the past almost 30 years, since I was 18, I've had a seizure disorder. And people, when they hear seizure disorder, oh, you frame it that way to downplay the term epilepsy. No, I was diagnosed with a seizure disorder, which means I'm just prone to seizures. And so what that means for me is lots of label reading because there's certain, everybody's triggers are different. And whether, for me personally, whether it be certain food additives, certain things they put in, deodorants, like um, certain lights bother me. And people are, for the most part, understanding about it. But for me, it means just being very vigilant and being extra cautious because you don't know, given the way our society is, what is in what. So you just have to be extra, extra careful. And one of the things that always strikes me, and I always use it sermonically, I remember I was in downtown Pittsburgh about 20 years ago, and I had a seizure around noon, which was rush hour. And no matter what city you live in, rush hour people are moving and there's ebbs and flows. And it was 3 hours later, and my aunt of all people found me on the ground. So why did people walk past me for 3 hours? What assumptions were made about me that during this busy time, and Pittsburgh's a relatively large city, um, what assumptions were made about me as I'm laying there in my diseased condition that caused people to walk past me for 3 hours? I could have been stroking out, or could have been something much worse than a seizure. So you get those assumptions, and whenever we hear the word seizure, we think of the flailing and flopping and so on and so forth. But now, over time, I have what's called absent seizures, where we can be talking right now, and one of y'all could ask me a question. I'm just literally absent. I'm just staring. I'm blank. I can't hear you. I'm rigid. I'm not going to fall. I'm just absent. Um, so one of the things for me, particularly being a Black man, is that you have to make sure that people know that you know. And I say that from the standpoint that the pharmaceutical industry is real, and doctors may have good intentions, but still tend to use us as guinea pigs. And, they say, oh, Mr. Hart, how are you feeling? Oh, I'm feeling good. Oh, we have this new medication, so on and so forth. Okay, well, not all things are for all people. And the way it works, pardon me, with seizure medications, certain seizure medications exacerbate seizures in other people. So if I say I've been doing okay on this, why are you trying to push something else upon me that could make my condition worse? So as warm and pleasant as I may look, I have some issues with our medical professionals, as well meaning as most of them are, and how they're wedded to the pharmaceutical community and pushing their agenda. So that's where some of my angst comes from. So
Thank
that's
you.
my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, thank you just for acknowledging that we often have an idea of this is what that means. This is what a seizure looks like. And so what I think it looks like is this. So then I'm ignoring and literally walking by somebody who is actively having a seizure because it doesn't register to me of this is what it might look like. And there's some judgment that's coming there too. I want to pull out one of the things you said and pass to Clay, that notion of how we try out medications and what that looks like when you have been on a variety of medications over a period of time. Thinking about how do they make that space inclusive when you go to the provider so you feel like you are heard? And can that happen? Can that particular space be inclusive? Or what have you seen in other spaces that you felt were inclusive?
So I feel like it could be inclusive, but it definitely is not. And I say that because having lupus and being a trans man has definitely given me so much insight as to how it could be inclusive and how they could be doing so much more to get to some type of, I wouldn't say cure, but to at least get to a space where we have a little bit more of hope when it comes to being diagnosed with lupus. And anybody who's familiar with lupus knows that there's a lot of different varieties of lupus, from being, very minor to extremely chronic. And so once, when I was diagnosed with lupus and like going through the stages of it and, going through it as I transitioned and seeing how my lupus did a complete 360 once I started T, because anybody who knows anything about lupus actually attacks. It's more prominent in Black women, than any other race and any other gender of people, and so they don't really know what the correlation is. But when I started T, I went from being on 28 pills. I took 28 pills in the morning and 14 at night, and then I went from that to now I take 13 pills every day. And so and five of which is just multivitamins. And so being in that predicament where I slowly seen, my medication intake go down and seeing how I had to do my own research when it came to a lot of the medications that I was on, because it would be times where, I would have a flare and I would need to go to the emergency room. And this doctor in the emergency room is like, oh, okay, I'm going to give you this as a temporary fix. And that medication collided with the ones that I'm already on, and they're telling me I could have internal bleeding, or, there was two medications that I was on that, caused cataracts, and I had to go and see a doctor every 6 months just to make sure that I'm not going blind. So, and it's like you really weighing, you know, am I okay with possibly going blind opposed to dying, and it's like really sitting with that realization that like these are medications that I have to be on for the rest of my life, some of them, and there are real life long-term effects to these medications, but they are life changing, and they can help me. And but in the same token, me being a Black man and knowing that I am sometimes in certain environments a lab rat, I have to do my own research and advocate for myself. And so it wasn't until, I started to transition and having to be in certain spaces that I really was like, I have to use my voice. I have to advocate for myself, because, it was times when I would go into the doctor and I'm telling him like, hey, this is what's going on. My ankle's swelling up. I don't know what's going on. And then they're just telling me that it's lupus symptoms. And it wasn't until about a year ago I was diagnosed with gout. And I'm like, all this time I'm walking around with the ankle brace on for 2 to 3 years, and they're telling me that it's tied to my lupus, and come to find out I have gout. And it's like and it wasn't until I really noticed that like until you have to have the mindset. These doctors work for me. It doesn't matter who you are. You're being paid by my insurance. So what I'm telling you, if you can't listen to me, I need to get another doctor. And so and I know sometimes it's hard for us to do that, but I had to come out of my comfort zone and say, hey, these people can kill me, and the only person who cares about me the way that I care about me is me. So, I it wasn't until I came to that realization that, you know, yes, some of this medication can help, but being on so many different medications, I have to be mindful of what I'm on, what I'm taking, what it can cause, and what other medications can collide with that. And so I actually, on my phone, I keep a list. Any doctors I go to, I ask if they have an app that I can go on, because I do take so many medications, and you never really know how much that really correlates with other doctors. Like even when I go to the eye doctor, letting them know all the different medications I'm on. I just recently found out that prednisone actually can cause eye issues. Didn't even know that until just yesterday. And I've been on prednisone for 8 years. So like, so it's just things like that like you don't know what you don't know until things happen. And when you have a disability, you can't allow things to happen. You have to know beforehand, because something happening can be detrimental to, not to just your health, but to your life.
Thank you for giving us a better understanding of just one piece of the puzzle, right? So the medical field may know this group is more impacted, but that next step of how does T or testosterone impact then your care isn't always the next step and the next thought that people are having in recognizing the facts of a diagnosis rather than just looking at the data and overall, this is what lupus means. I appreciate you bringing in the reality of, and I feel like a couple of y'all have said that in different ways, of research, that you have to do research, you have to learn, you have to have the list on your phone, you have to advocate for yourself. And I'm curious, as y'all see that collaborative behavior where someone really is collaborating with you as a provider or even as a friend versus that othering that can happen when you go to see providers. And Jesse, I'm going to start with you and then I'll go to Edward.
Okay, so you're asking about what does collaborative healthcare look like?
Yeah,
Okay.
collaborative healthcare and collaboration in your day-to-day life. There are people who support you in your day-to-day life versus there are others who might see what's happening, but they're not figuring out how to support. They're kind of like, oh, that's over there. And they're doing some of that othering behavior. And you can name both of how that looks when someone's really collaborating in the health field and outside of it, or when you can recognize that othering is happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, thanks. I think one of the most othering things is when people either ignore my disability or on the flip side, overemphasize it to the point where I feel reduced to just that thing, like that's all that I could be. Um, so, on the one hand, some people pretend it's not there and act like if they mention that I have long COVID, or that I could be tired or dizzy or need rest, that um, you know, that's a problem. Um, and because what that ends up doing is then, it just, yeah, it that feels othering for sure. Um, so, a lot of, and then sometimes people feel like they assume they know more about my body than I do and offer advice that I didn't really ask for in terms of treating it, um, all the time. So that can be grating and just tiring as well. So I think collaborative behaviors really are more like people listening to what I'm actually saying is going on with me, and asking questions is great, like without assuming they know. Um and I think uh recognizing that we've done a lot of research in our own situation is important, right? And not just coming at me like, oh yeah, I read something about long COVID, so now I know I'm going to diagnose you and tell you all these things that you need to try now. But rather asking questions, have have you tried this? Have you heard of this study? That's great. Like I love to research more and try to figure out what I could do, but sometimes it just feels like I'm not there when people are just telling me what they know that doesn't match my reality. So,
Thank you for bringing that into the space. What I heard in what you're saying is that idea of the wholeness of people, right? Like, yes, I have this, and this is what that looks like for me. And our desire to fix. Well, try this, try that, and then you're fixed. And that really is rooted in that ableism of that you have to look and be and perform in this way. And the goal is to get you to be able to look and be and perform in this way, because then it doesn't interrupt my day. Then I don't have to think about, hey, I'm asking you to be in meetings back to back. I don't have to change anything. If I get you to change, I can continue to navigate in this way that is likely not helpful for anybody, but especially not helpful for you.
Yeah, thank you for that frame.
Edward, I want to give you that same opportunity of talking about how people can collaborate with you, or that othering behavior that people exhibit when you're engaging with them.
I think one of the most frustrating things we've touched on a little bit already is that um, people just assume if you take your medication a certain way, if you do that medication's the end all be all, at least in my instance. But I could take my medicine to a T for a year, but if I go get my favorite food, which is a bag of Doritos and a wild cherry Pepsi, then it doesn't matter how much medication I have in my system, that MSG and those Doritos and that caffeine and that Pepsi is going to disrupt my nervous system. So there is, as I referenced earlier, there's not a one size fits all approach. So again, just knowing your triggers, and again, people not making assumptions about what is right for your body, because everybody reacts differently, whether it be to medications, whether it be to chemical stimulants. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents on that. And the one thing I wanted to bring up, I was thinking about when Jesse was talking, my biggest advocate is stunningly silent upstairs. That's my 6-year-old daughter. And we see, this is February now. It was after Christmas, because we had a whole bunch of people over here spreading germs everywhere. And I'd had a seizure. And when I came out of it, she was holding my head. And I thought you were going to die. And as Samantha knows, I'm not the most emotional person, but when I heard that, it was very upsetting. But that she knew what to do when she saw me reacting a certain way was comforting as well. It's a shame that she has to know that at 6, but she saw Daddy in trouble and knew to go up, try to keep his head still so he doesn't bang it off of anything. So some things are caught, not taught.
Thank you.
And yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Didn't want to cut you
No,
off.
no, you're good. I'm good.
Thank you. I think something I've talked about before is, who are the people around you who don't make you feel like your disability is a hindrance to them, to how they engage in the world. I said earlier, I have a sleep disorder, and I have a hard time staying awake all day if I don't take my meds. And people like to say, oh, that would be so great. I'm an insomniac. Oh, just drink coffee. And there's this notion of what will work because of their experience in their lives, but also what care looks like is how I think care looks. Care is me passing out halfway through a movie and you're not mad. You're going to replay the whole movie for me, or you're going to give me a play-by-play, right? It's people figuring out what works for you and being able, like Jesse was saying, to be in conversation with you. Like Edward was saying, to be able to jump in when you need them to jump in. And like Clay was saying, to just listen. I've done the research. I know what's happening in my body. And that's something we know across the board is an area of growth in the medical field, but especially with Black patients, them listening to what we're saying. I've had pharmacists catch things that a doctor didn't catch. Those to me are the best in the medical field, are pharmacists, because they're seeing this and going, you shouldn't take this with that. That's not going to work with this. That's their specialty. And they take the time to have that conversation. And so just also, I think, continue to expand on how we think about disability justice goes beyond the medical field. It goes to the chat rooms where people are sharing their real experience. and helping people learn and come to terms and say the words they might not have been able to say. I didn't use the word disability 10 plus years ago when I got diagnosed with my sleep disorder. I started using it when I started needing accommodations. That's when I made the choice to use that word, because we make that word tied to accommodations instead of just tied to being in a community of care. What does that look like for us to just be in a community of care? Since Invalid have outlined the 10 principles of disability justice, and I'm going to say them here for you today, and then I'll invite the panelists to speak on them as well. So the first one being that intersectionality, recognizing that we don't live single issue lives. I think we've all spoken to that in different ways of how our gender, our age, our idea of self, what ableism looks like when it's tied to the supremacy that is our world. That leadership of the most impacted, being led by those who know these symptoms, who know these systems, are going to be able to guide us in a way that people outside of it cannot. It has to be anti-capitalist. We can't be focused on the medication providers. It has to be focused on what can I just do that's free. The biggest thing for me is sleep hygiene. It's never something I heard about because no one gets money off of me going to sleep at a certain time. So recognizing the way our care is tied to someone making money off of us, for better or for worse. There's a commitment to cross-movement organizing. We know that disability justice is tied to other issues and that individuals who are incarcerated don't get the same access to care. And there's so many other things that I could name in that reality of disability justice. So we have to be tied to doing cross-movement organizing. Jesse, I think you spoke to this most directly, but recognizing the wholeness of people. We are not consumers. We are not people who just take. We are whole people. And when you can recognize people as whole people, then you can figure out the ways to support them in their experience and see their full history. And good day or bad day, they're still the same person. We have to have a mindset of sustainability. That's the hardest one because we live in an ableist world and we live in a world that's about capitalism, to take that time that we need to pace ourselves, to recognize I need that time, and pushing myself beyond what my body needs right now is not sustainable. So we can get that liberation and that justice when we can sustain ourselves and we're provided an opportunity to do so. That commitment to cross-disability solidarity. So the insights and the participation of all the people within the disability movement. We all have different viewpoints based on our experiences and how we came to terms with our diagnosis. And so being able to be in conversation within the community is important. It's hard sometimes to ask for help, but interdependence is how we move forward. How we meet each other's needs, how we build towards that liberation, looking at those solutions. Everyone spoke to the reality of speaking to other people and having them help. We have to be able to not be hyper independent, but be able to look in and connect with other people. We have to build collective access, recognizing the reality that in this community and in the broad world, everyone's access is different. Bringing flexibility and creativity to what we allow to happen. How do I think about how you're performing, Jesse? How do I think about when you're preaching, Edward? How do I think about hiring you, Clay? I have to recognize that I want you in the space and create a space that's accessible to you. The ultimate goal that we reach towards is that collective liberation, that nobody's left behind, that we're continuing to move together, and that we accomplish the revolution we require. Means everyone's a part of it. I said a lot of words. And there are things that naturally stick out to us. We are Black Lives Matter at school. So what sticks out to me is that intersectionality piece of how we think about disability and our Blackness. I'd love to know that combination for you, but also what's a principle that you think is important that you want to lift up and how we can do advocacy work, kind of that call to action for the people in the space. And then I'll take questions. So if you have a question, please put that in the chat now. And if you have it for a particular person, name that, or if it's for the panelist as a whole. But let's start with Edward. what's a principle for you for how people can do this advocacy work? And how do you see the intersection of your Blackness and your seizure disorder?
Actually, I was not going to speak to that. I was going to kind of hijack things because the principles speak to the context in which I'm in, which, I talked about briefly what's going on with my dad. And my dad has vascular dementia. And again, the advocacy, and when I heard you mention the capitalistic and consumer aspect of this, that's what wanted me to go on this real quick tangent, and particularly how it speaks to us. My dad's 80, and vascular dementia is a different type of dementia. He just is to that stage where he can't care for himself, and he needs assisted living. That's just the reality. He understands that. It's very humbling. And I'm an only child, and just seeing how the system is that, you know, he's 80, he worked, but his Social Security and pensions, he makes too much money to qualify for state assistance for long-term care, but assisted living is private care. And at least here in Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania, for dementia care, they start at $6,000 a month. I mean, it's not his tax bracket nor mine. And just seeing the inequity of everything for the care that he needs, even in the sunset season, is just extraordinary. Because, I mean, truth be told, when I went to even visit some of these places, there were people who did not look like us, who were from affluent backgrounds, who could afford six, seven, eight, $9,000 a month for your loved one to continue living with dignity. It's just something that was appalling to me. But I wanted to throw that out there. Maybe it had nothing to do with nothing, but
No,
that's right.
I think it's important. I remember once speaking with someone and them saying that we're all pre-disability, that if we live to a certain point, we're all going to need support and assistance. How much support and how much assistance differs from person to person. But if we lived in a world with that mindset that we're all pre-disabled, it would change how we set up those services. Those services aren't just for the elite. Support is for everybody, regardless of age and regardless of income. So thank you for bringing that forward, because I do think sometimes we don't name age and how that impacts our bodies as disability. We just name it as, oh, that's getting older. You're going to need hearing aids. You're going to need this. You're going to need that. But the reality of how we look at how disability impacts your day-to-day life, that is the road that people are moving towards.
Which real quick then,
Yeah, go ahead,
reminds me of
Evan.
another thing real quick, that exactly what you said, which goes back to advocacy, because as his memory was diminishing, oh, it's just that season. It's just, can we take a look at an MRI? Can we have a CT scan? Well, we don't think that's necessary for him because it's just natural age, just natural regression. Lo and behold, and it's by no means patting myself on the back, push for MRI, CT scan showed multiple mini strokes, micro hemorrhages, and the vascular diminishing of things, which led to the diagnosis. But in particular, doctors want to chalk it up to no disease or disability at all. So that's why advocacy is important. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thinking about the person as a whole, not just zoning in on that, well, they're this age, so that means this thing, but being able to look at the full scope of who's in front of me allows me to give them the care that they need. Jesse, I saw you came off mute, so I'll give you an opportunity. And then Clay, if there's a principle that you want to speak to for how people might move forward in doing advocacy. And then the chat's open, y'all.
Yeah, it was powerful hearing you read out all of the principles of disability justice and just really sitting with that and thinking about how those relate to my life. So thank you for having me hear those in a new way. Because I think when we talk about intersectionality, it means understanding that being Black and disabled means navigating two systems of oppression at once. And it really does show up in the way people engage with me, whether that's the healthcare system or it's like movement spaces or daily life. Um, you know, and activist spaces are often about this grind culture, like people expected to be strong, to push through, to keep going no matter what. Like there's so much on the line. We're in the fight for justice. You need to lay it all out there. And there's this unspoken assumption that rest is a luxury, not a necessity in too many of our movements. And I think, especially for Black folks, right? That's a direct result of how Black people have also been conditioned to survive in a world that constantly devalues us. And so we sometimes internalize that we gotta just keep going. But I think disability justice challenges us to think differently about it. That it teaches us we don't have to work ourselves to exhaustion to prove we belong in the movement, right? Um, so we have to make these spaces in our, whether it's our classrooms or it's in social movements or organizations or at work, we got to keep advocating for spaces like communities of care, as you said, Sam. I really liked how you frame that. And I just see how Blackness shapes whose disabilities are believed and whose aren't. Um, when white people talk about their chronic illness or disability, I think they're more likely to be seen in need of care, rest, and space. You know, although I think all of our capitalist culture sees us as sources of profit rather than human beings. Um, but, I think there's a deeply ingrained idea that Black bodies are tougher and we can endure more. And that means we get denied health care or accommodations that we need sometimes. And I see, I don't know if folks saw RFK Jr. in his testimony to Congress, but he was pushing his anti-vax rhetoric, suggesting that Black people should be on a different vaccine schedule because we have different immune systems, and just, basically saying like throw them out there without any vaccination protections. And I think that's part of a long history of medical racism. Uh, and it was just shocking to me to see that out in the open in our government. But I just want to say to end in terms of advocacy, there's some important efforts. You see, I got this shirt from a long COVID advocacy group that does important work, called the long COVID, or long hauler advocacy project. And if people know folks with long COVID, that's an organization you can check out. And the Long Hauler Advocacy Project was started by folks with long COVID and takes an intersectional approach, which I've appreciated. They have affinity groups for Black folks, for LGBTQ folks, to talk about how these issues are specifically impacting their communities. And they've organized to fight for legislation to support people with long COVID. I've had to leave my my classroom. Like teaching was my calling. I taught for over 20 years in the classroom, and I can't do it sounds coming from multiple directions, the exhaustion and just being dizzy all the time means I can't be in the classroom. And there just aren't, protections or social security benefits for people with long COVID. And so this long hauler advocacy project is fighting for funding for the Moonshot Act, which was introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders in August of 2024. And the legislation proposes a comprehensive federal response to long COVID, including $10 billion for a research program um, led by someone with expertise in long COVID. And it's like, that's what care would look like in the society, is investing in our health and trying to support us. But instead, this country wants to invest in bombing schools in Gaza by the billions, right? They have billions for wars, for tax breaks for the rich, um, and all these things, but not to support us. And that's why we have to have that intersectional approach where we're in solidarity with Palestinians, where we're in solidarity with folks who are houseless, um, because it's going to take all of us to change the spending priorities of this country and to build a society that is really a beloved community where we're all valued regardless of our ability.
Thank you for bringing forward that, like, what does it not just look like in our day-to-day lives, but in our society? And I want to jump actually to a different question, if it's all right. Jesse, when you spoke about being in school, where Black Lives Matter at school, right? And I remember applying for jobs and thinking about what's the accommodation that I need. And the accommodation that I needed was a planned period at a certain time of day that I need to take a nap. That was what the accommodation could have been like for me. I'm curious how y'all think specifically in schools, what does that look like for them to be advocates, for them to support our kids, and in reality, their parents? Oftentimes, our schools are not accessible in a variety of ways. And so I would love to hear y'all speak to real quick, what do the schools need to do? How do we make our schools support our Black lives, including those with disabilities? Clay, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Well, I think for me, again, education is important. Because again, everyone makes this assumption that everybody has the same capacity when we don't. And of course, I'm a single father of three teenagers. And so I have to do a lot of advocating for my children. I have to do a lot of advocating for myself. And I have two children who have 504 plans. And so sometimes, especially having lupus, that fatigue, it's a lot, And so being physically and mentally drained, it takes a huge toll on you. And so, like, a lot of times when I'm dealing with the schools and things like that, like, I have to express to them, like, listen, I don't have the capacity to deal with you all today, And I feel like as a Black man, no matter how you try to express that, it comes across aggressive, because I'm a Black man. And it's like, no, you need to give me the grace when I'm explaining to you I am tired. I'm tired of fighting with you all today. I just don't have the capacity to argue. And it's like, because it is an argument, I shouldn't have to continue to fight with you. I shouldn't have to continue to validate the fact that I have a disability, my children have a disability, and these are the accommodations that we need to make sure that we succeed. And so I feel like people need to educate themselves. And with me having lupus, because it is so commonly known and because it can look like a variety of things, like Jesse said, people make these assumptions because they know this person or my aunt or my mom has lupus, and they just automatically make these assumptions that, oh, well, this person has lupus, so this must be what your lupus is like. And it's like, well, no two people with lupus is alike, And I really feel like because of that ignorance, people just make these assumptions that you can do these things that I may not be capable of doing, or maybe I can do them and the next person can't do it, And so when it comes to schools and, it was a time that I was in the hospital. My kids missed a week of school. And, now I'm being held accountable, even though I'm giving you documentation showing I was in the hospital for a week. So what do you want me to do? You want me to rewind time and send them back to school? It's impossible. And so I just feel like it's the lack of education, it's the lack of empathy, it's the lack of a lot of things, especially in the school environment, that they don't give you any type of grace to be sick. They don't give you any type of grace to just feel not up to it. And like you said, I should be able to take a mental health day. I should be able to take some time to rest because that is a requirement for me to be my best self. And if I'm not being given that, then how can I show up to you and be in my best health? No, you're going to get the cranky me. You're going to get the aggravated me. You're going to get the aggressive me because now I'm not in the mental space to deal with you. And unfortunately, I feel like they need to broaden, you know, giving schools and giving teachers a, even just a little bit of sit down and say, hey, let's find out because just asking questions, asking questions go a long way. Ask me, am I in the space to be able to have this conversation with you? Ask me, am I in the space to listen to this voicemail where you want to complain about my child today? And maybe I'm just not feeling it. But unfortunately, people just feel like they would rather just be ignorant to the fact than to educate themselves or ask questions and just say that I don't know. It's nothing wrong with saying that I don't know, but they would rather be blissful in their ignorance and be okay with it, and that's not okay. I think one of my experiences that always sticks out with me was I actually went one time I went to a job interview and I did a drug test and it came back positive for marijuana. And I'm like, dude, I know I hadn't smoked. Like, I'm freaking out because I'm like, dude, I know I hadn't smoked anything. I knew I should have passed this drug test and everything. And the lady looks at me and I'm like telling her, like, it must be from one of my lupus medications that this is coming up like this. Lady looks me dead in the face and says, my aunt has lupus and none of her medications make her come back like this. And I was like, lady, are you serious? So luckily I call my doctor, I tell her what's going on. And it actually was one of the medications that I had recently been put on that it actually does make you come back for a positive, drug test. So I call her back and the doctor faxed over the paperwork to show them that this is the medication, this is what's going on, and this is why I had this happen. And so of course, I went back to them. I was like, I deserve an apology. I don't want to work for you now, but I deserve an apology. And I'm just thinking, like, I'm glad that I know this because, like, let's think about if I was in the environment with my kids where maybe at the school they wanted me to take a drug test or do something with the school and my drug test came back. And that's another thing with medications that we don't know how it would show up in different environments. And that could have put me in a predicament that could have been dangerous for me. And so I just think that, like, educating yourself on different disabilities or even just educating yourself to learn how to have grace for people you don't know go a long way.
Thank you, Clay. I heard two things in what you said. One was looking into what's behind something. A kid's not in school for a week, a parent isn't responding to my email right away, to not assume that I know the why, but to take some time to engage with people, to get to know them, to hear what they have to say. Jesse, there's a question in the chat I would love for you to speak to. And they're asking specifically for educators when you can't teach in person, whether that's due to health restrictions or other barriers. What does work for you to keep the work going when you're facing that struggle of not being able to be there in person? And what advice do you have for other educators?
Yeah, it's been a huge adjustment for me. I really miss being with the kids. I've found ways, alternative spaces to mentor youth. So that's one piece of advice I'd give. Like, I can be outside better than I can be inside where noises are bouncing off the walls everywhere. So like, helping to coach my kids' team connects me with youth and, I'll get tired. I need to sit down. Or I'll get too dizzy and nauseous and I'll have to leave or not show up to practice one day. But if I'm open with the team about what I'm going through and they know, then they've been really understanding. So finding other spaces and youth activist spaces have been great too, getting to help mentor youth in the Seattle Student Union. Um, you know, a lot of it can be done remotely. Uh, or Black Lives Matter at school, we've organized this week of action. And in Seattle, I was able to help the youth organize a press conference to announce their demands for the schools. And so I can't be in the classroom, but there's different ways I can connect with youth. Um, and I just, one of the things that's so important for me is just focusing on what I'm grateful for every day really helps get me through this challenge. And I am really grateful that I can still contribute to mentoring youth and to building the social movements, um, what if it's remotely. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm going to speak to that too, and then I'm going to wrap us up pretty quickly. One person put a question in the chat, and I want to name that question and bring it forward. And I want to give it the time it deserves. So I'm going to put the question out. I would love to be able to answer it fully, but wanting to honor people's time. So I'm going to put it out there. If there are people in the chat who want to give advice, please do. And then we as BLM at School will also send you some additional thoughts that we have regarding your question. But I just want to wrap up with what Jesse was speaking to and Joseph has asked. And I think part of this work really is a reframing that things don't have to look a certain way. I love educating. I call myself a community-based educator, and that's what I do. And we can't focus so much on this is what I'm supposed to be. This is the title that I have. And we have to honor those little moments. So I spoke at a conference this weekend. I spoke to maybe 40 kids. In a normal school day, I'd speak to 100 kids, right? But the impact for those 40 kids was still there. And so being able to celebrate that, to be able to pour into them as leaders, like Jesse was speaking to. So maybe I can't teach them one-on-one, but I can teach them about activism. I can put something in front of them that's going to help them continue to learn and grow. And that is educating. So I encourage you to reframe a little bit of how it looks to keep the work going. Might not look the same. It can't look the same due to your restrictions or others, but that doesn't mean the work has to stop. It's just a reframe and centering it on what you can do and supporting the one or two kids. I have some great students I've worked with that I will be like, that's the one, right? And that was one student out of 50. But that's how we start real revolution, and real movements are in those actions, those one or two actions that snowball into a bigger movement. So I want to thank y'all for your time, for putting the questions in the chat, for continuing to do this work. Find the ways in your community that make sense for you to take on those 10 principles, to push against that hustle culture, to maybe it's naming people as whole people and helping people think about the work collectively. So I encourage you to look at those 10 principles, think about one to bring into your community, into your school, into your neighborhood, into your interactions. So that way disability justice isn't just something we talk about today, but it's something that we